Hello and welcome to Just Unjust, a podcast featuring stories of injustice from around the United States. This is episode 3 of our special multi-part series on the case of Tracy Zornes, a man convicted of the brutal double homicide of 2 of his friends in Moorhead, Minnesota, and for which no hard evidence against him exists. In the last episode, Tracy took us through his arrest and trial, at the end of which he was ultimately found guilty of the murders and sentenced to life without parole. In this episode, Tracy will take us through his multiple appeals, as well as a new post-conviction investigation, which includes 2 independent forensic experts' findings that Tracy's pocket knife and small hammer found at his campsite could not have been the murder weapons. A finding that is additionally corroborated by DNA analysis and a longtime private investigator's findings that revealed a different possible perpetrator. Let's get back into Tracy's story. So Tracy, after your conviction and subsequent sentencing, you began the lengthy and burdensome process of appealing your conviction. So your first appeal is what is called a direct appeal, which deals specifically with any procedural errors that might have occurred during trial, but it doesn't really consider anything else like the facts of the case or any new evidence. It's just examining the question of, did the trial occur in a legally proper way? Let's pick back up with your first appeal.
The direct appeal was the appellate public defender's office with Stephen Russett. He thought he did a real good job. We spoke frequently, written to him, but there was some issues. The issues about the weapons. My tools, what they said were the weapons that could have been used to commit these crimes. And I thought there should have been some type of further examination of them. But the direct appeal isn't to raise any new issues or question any of the evidence. It's simply to question the process, what happened during the process. Apparently, I was supposed to raise those issues, and then they would be dismissed, and then I'd be able to raise them again later on a post-conviction petition, or the court would refer my issues back to a post-conviction petition. Your direct appeal, you have 2 years under Minnesota statute to raise issues in post-conviction petition. And then under the Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act, you have 1 year to file a habeas corpus petition in federal court. So all these things, they were confusing. It was almost the entirety of a year. I spent time from my direct appeal. There was 4 issues that were raised regarding the trial process itself. Those were all dismissed by the Minnesota Supreme Court. And I spent most of the next year reading some law. I took my time, trying to understand everything. I had obtained most of the court file, I believe. Right from the start, I didn't understand the timelines or anything. I told Mr. Russett, I said, well, look, just take your time, because I'm not in a hurry. I think all I need is some investigation, and like that would have cleared everything up or something, but he said, no, we can't. There's specific timelines and whatnot that we have to adhere to. So we went through that process. It seemed, I certainly thought everything was going to turn out right. He wrote a really good brief, salient points and all. And they turned down every one of them for a variety of reasons, some made up, it seemed. So over that next year, I went to work and I filed my first post-conviction petition. I thought it was pretty good. It was like a crash course trying to prepare the post-conviction petition for state court in order to maintain my federal habeas deadline. Raised a number of claims, and one had to do with the tools. The autopsy reports were never submitted as evidence in trial. This allowed the medical examiner to imply that my tools could be the murder weapons. Well, I submitted those autopsy reports and made the claims in my post-conviction that anybody with a ruler can make the measurements and see that they don't fit. The tools argument was the greatest one, because not possible that, like the DNA, it's not possible you can present these items to the jury and not have them believe that they could have been murder weapons. I mean, they got them zip tied to little cardboard pieces and walking up and down in front of the jury with them, you know, while they talked about how these people were murdered with a single-edged knife. And look here, we found this single-edged knife in the defendant's pocket when he was arrested. The prosecutor during closing arguments was pretty deliberately inflammatory. The medical examiner, he had said that he counted the wounds to John. He said, at my best guess, that he was struck 21 times. And so when the prosecutor was giving her closing, she said, you know, now think about this. He was very determined to kill these people. You know, he struck John with his hammer 21 times. 1, 2, 3, you know, walking around the courtroom with this deliberate cadence, trying to make the people imagine every time that I supposedly hit him. I mean, I guess that's her job, but it was deceptive and inflammatory. Of course, you know, the measurements are impossible, and I mean, most importantly, my lawyer never brought it up. But these stab wounds were measured at 20 centimeters deep, and darn, the bleed on my pocket knife is only 6. The jury was left to retire with this factually inaccurate impression that I had the means to commit that crime. That was one of the main points of argument during trial, was that I had the means to commit these crimes. The prosecutor stated, well, we don't have a motive, but a motive's not necessary for a conviction, but he had the means and the opportunity. You know, so if we would have had some type of forensic expert or expert of any kind to examine these items and exclude them, then they were left with the opportunity, which everyone had. Anybody in that neighborhood had the opportunity. You know, the means were what seemed to be the deciding factor in my particular instance. After the district court denied my post-conviction petition, I filed the appeal to the Minnesota Supreme Court. And the district court decided that all of my claims were barred by failure to raise them at an earlier point in time, because they were deemed to be trial issues that I should have raised on direct appeal. But the Minnesota Supreme Court, they went further. They decided, instead of addressing the claim in any way, they decided that my pocket knife, well, it could have been used to make the ear wounds. even if it wasn't the murder weapon and all of that, that it, without, I mean, I know they didn't measure anything because I've made the measurements and other more competent people have done these things and determined that they couldn't have. But the lawyers on the court, they decided my weapons could have been used in the crime because they could have made the ear wounds on the ear. That's a major point of contention with me, because every court since has echoed, without examination or without any supporting evidence, they've echoed the same medical determination made by the Minnesota Supreme Court that these could have been used in the crime. Therefore, their inclusion wasn't error. During that time, while I was waiting and in the process of appealing my post-conviction petition, I had printed off a list of the top 50 law schools and made a disc that contained my transcripts and filings and issues, and sent it with a cover letter to every law school on my list, and everyone wrote back and said, well, write to the Minnesota Innocence Project. We can't advise you, and there's timelines, and you should probably, just kick rocks. There was nothing encouraging in any of it. But then I got in contact at the end of 2015. I got in contact with Suzanne McComas. Well, the list is long. She started as military police. When, after 8 years in the service, she got out and she had a brief stint as an actual police officer before she got her private investigator's license and started working on that full time. She had helped a number of people over the years that had claims of innocence and wrongful imprisonment of one manner or another. But she was a private investigator for many years. And we spoke. She asked me about the case, and one of the most important things from her perspective was trying to get help with some technicality to get out of prison, or what was the reason. The reason is actual innocence, and she said she would help me do what she could. She had started her investigation at the beginning of 2016. I sent her boxes and boxes of transcripts and police reports, everything I had. And some of the questions and insights she provided was just unbelievable. It was towards the end of April, about the third week of April in 2016, when she was familiar and comfortable enough with the case that she flew up to Minnesota, and she traveled around up in Moorhead and Fargo and out to the res and further investigated. It was still a pretty hostile environment. Had called to try to schedule an appointment with the police at the Moorhead Police Department. She met with the police department there briefly. It didn't sound like they were very cooperative. And then after she left there, then she picked up a tail, so the police followed her around town, to see what else she was getting into.
That just makes me so suspicious right there. If the police department is so confident they got the right person in this crime, why be so tight-lipped and hostile towards another person looking at the case? Typically, when people are highly confident and competent in their work, they're happy to share it because they know it's ironclad. However, when people know they messed up, that's usually when they don't want people sniffing around.
And she had called to the White Earth Police Department and scheduled a meeting with the chief of police down there. And when she showed up, it sounded like there was just a overly crowded office. There's actually a person or multiple people spit at her and, making, just being extremely rude and disrespectful. And, it really upset me that anybody would treat her like that. She's just, trying to be of some assistance.
Wow. And these are people from your own reservation. Do you think they were so upset at an investigator looking into your case because they thought you were guilty? Or why do you think they treated McComas like that?
That's a real tough one, the people, there's some people up there that are just so filled with hate, and, among them people are some of Megan's own families. Before this happened, they wouldn't let her come stay at their house or anything like that, but afterwards, it's like, we were the greatest friends in the world. We loved her. Well, they didn't really treat her like that. They continue those behaviors to this day. Hate-filled, organized resistance. One of the observers, the prosecutor had two of them that they had in court every day. These were family members, paid observers of the trial. So they're going home and telling all of their family, they're the ones started spreading these lies that Megan was raped and my DNA was on her body and I stabbed her in the heart and, just all these obscene lies to, I don't know, generate opposition to me or to just, I don't know, but they continue to this day. I've never really talked about all of this stuff with, or, not the whole story with any of family or anything. We've gone over parts, talked about parts of it, but nobody's ever really seen any of the paperwork either. The police reports and the DNA reports and all of the lab reports, these are pretty clear. There was no DNA on the bodies. There was no rape. There was, they're easily provable lies, but I've always been so caught up in trying to fight this case, just didn't have
the resources to fight the rumors. And fighting the rumor mill should never be part of the battle anyway, but yet so often and in so many cases it is. Going back to the McComas investigation, she met up with the White Earth Police Department and had an unwelcome experience there. A similar unwelcome and unnerving experience with the Moorhead Police Department, where they followed her around town as she investigated the area. Let's talk more about what she did in Moorhead, the city where the crimes occurred.
She spent considerable time driving around in Moorhead, observing various surveillance cameras, and she spent days up there driving around, interviewing people and trying to learn what she could, and in the end, her investigation was just so surprising. It's the only thing that's kept my case alive this far, because she went just going over all of the paperwork and talking to people. At the scene, or at the time of the crime, the police department had went around collecting surveillance tapes and whatnot. And when they had assigned somebody to look at these tapes, their assignment was to look for me. You know, look for this car and look for Tracy Zornes. Nobody else is involved. You know, that their only focus is me. But when McComas did her investigation, she found dozens of other surveillance tapes that were never collected that would have or could have shown the real perpetrators, including right across the street. Right across the street from the apartment building was a halfway house or some type of group home setting, and they had a camera right above their door that's recording everything happening out there. I don't understand it. It's not possible that the police didn't know. Here's where criminals live. They got surveillance right there. It's just impossible that they didn't know that, or that they shouldn't have collected that. And all along the routes in that surrounding area, there was more surveillance. I mean, she detailed so much of it in her report. It was just surprising because the police said they had so much, but they didn't have anything that matters. They got some surveillance from the drugstore downtown, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the area, you know. She was all the way down to Wapaton. There was surveillance listed all along that road, and Detective Nelson and Martin, they had been down there to interview Saul Grotto. He was their original suspect in these crimes, or at least until they discovered my name. At that point, they dropped everything to focus on me. But, I mean, there was, like, farm equipment dealers right along the highway with visible cameras, you know. They had threatened Saul, well, we better not catch you on any of these cameras driving up to Fargo or Moorhead, and, you know, but they never attempted to get copies of any of this. When, like, the equipment dealers, they said, we have over $1 million of inventory sitting on the side of the road. Our cameras are going 24 hours a day, and we retain the video for 30 days. But they never bothered looking for these guys.
Did you ever find out why Saul Grotto was the original suspect? Did he have a history or something that, or just by the fact that obviously Saul and the victims knew each other pretty well from the sounds of it all, that they were all connected with one another? Is that possibly a reason, or?
I don't, you know, I don't know if Saul was newer to the situation. Megan's boyfriend was Cassie's brother. So that's where Cassie came into the picture, but it doesn't sound like they really got along between Cassie and Megan. And John knew Cassie prior to Megan entering the picture. That's the impression I got, that they knew each other or were aware of each other. But from my understanding, the original relationship or friendship was between John and Cassie. Megan and Saul were a later thing, and not really a happy connection between any of them, from what I recall, or the impression that I got. I guess the police knew him, and they knew he lived there. That as soon as it happened, well, they went right to him because they expected it was something he would do or be involved in, or...
That's what I was wondering, if it was based on his history or complaints that had been filed against him at some point in the past, or something that would cause them to immediately look at him.
Yeah, that would be my guess, you know. They had prior experience or knowledge of him and was right square in the middle of it.
These murders were absolutely horrific, and something in my mind keeps thinking that there had to be some sort of struggle between the perpetrators and Megan and John. And since this happened in an apartment complex, wouldn't the noise of a struggle be waking the neighbors up?
So, I mean, it's a shared ventilation system, you know. So, I mean, if I'm talking at my vent, we're having a conversation with the people upstairs.
Yeah, that's what makes me so surprised that 911 calls weren't coming in before the deaths occurred, and during the time where one would expect a struggle to have been occurring that resulted in the murders.
I mean, well, they had already, that was part of the problem there. They, you know, from Cassie and Saul arguing and fighting, there had already been noise complaints, you know. So that was part of the issue with Megan being there and John being there. Megan's supposed to be the only one, but John has a phone, you know, so, I mean, he was giving them the ride, and his phone is necessary to try to coordinate the further ride to get back to the res, you know, and Cassie's worried about more noise or, you know, some abusing the trust or the apartment somehow, you know, and getting her in trouble.
The eyewitness who lived at the ground level, who gave the description of the person leaving the scene minutes before the 911 call about the fire came in, did he state if he heard any noises like a fight or a struggle prior to seeing a person leaving?
He said that he'd heard noise, like a tweaker or somebody continuous talking, rapid, non-stop. He never mentioned it as yelling or any, you know, overly loud or anything like that. But the other people in the other upstairs apartment had reported noise also. Again, it wasn't distinct, but they had reported noise of somebody having sex down there. And by Moreland, he had reported the non-stop talking and some distinct noises. He might have said like a wiffle ball bat or something, you know, hitting, like slapping it on the couch or something like that. I'm not exactly sure. It was something right along those lines, though, but both occupants of the other apartments did report noise. But it didn't sound like it was a lot overbearing. It led me to believe that there was multiple people in the apartment. If somebody's in a situation like that, I mean, I just have to imagine they would yell or scream, or there would be some type of loud, startling noise rather than this quiet, muffled sound that everybody's reporting.
Right. It's hard to imagine that a single perpetrator could overpower two people quietly, especially if, as you said, John was not a small man. But several perpetrators might be able to do so.
The original witness from the scene, he was 6 feet away, and he described the person seen leaving the scene just minutes before the 911 call. That he testified at trial. he described the person. Now, he's been living in the same place for 5, 6 years. You know, it's a multi-level, split-level apartment. So the bottom one where the crime happened is maybe it's the garden level. It's kind of half basement with the windows and the top half of the walls. Moreland, his apartment was the next one up, so his windows would be at head level. He's been living there for 5 or 6 years at this time when this happened. And he described the person leaving the scene. He said, I knew it wasn't a woman, and I knew it wasn't the guy that lived in the apartment, because this guy was shorter and heavier than the guy who lived in the apartment. And what McComas discovered later was the guy that lived in the apartment, he is 5'9", and I'm 6'2", so it'd be hard to describe me as shorter than him. The most surprising thing about McComas' investigation, all else aside, this is 6 years after the crime, and she's going through the paperwork. She's investigating people and alternative perpetrators and trying to discover the truth of what went on. I mean, there was a couple other people. There was one guy who had committed a number of weapons type assaults, and he was currently in prison in North Dakota on some murder charge. He was in the area at the time. There was somebody else she had found, and that was just amazing to me. I thought, man, okay, we have a legitimate perpetrator or alternative. But then one day I got an email from her, and I gave her a call, and she asked me about Saul's brother. I was like, I don't know. Does he have one? Apparently he had a brother. He was just released from jail the week before these crimes were committed. And the most surprising was that he fit the description exactly given of the perpetrator leaving the scene. That was just unbelievable. He was on a federal pre-trial release he was out on the 3 affiliated tribes reservation out in western North Dakota. He had climbed in through the window on his ex-girlfriend, and he had assaulted her with a bottle and threatened her with a knife. I mean, it was assault resulting in bodily harm and assault with a dangerous weapon. And, you know, he had held the victim down and he hit her in the forehead with this bottle. She had one of the exact markings as Megan Londo did. And the aunt that was in the house had reported, you know, he's screaming, you Indian bitches are all whores, and, you know, other foul, derogatory names. He was arrested for that. He was in jail for a couple months. He was released the week before, and he was released to his parents' house in Wahpeton. So the police knew that for certain because he was just picked up in Wahpeton for a drunk and disorderly incident. He was held, and the police contacted his federal agent, and they said, tell him he has to report to me in Fargo on the 19th, and we'll discuss whatever we're going to do. And, well, the 19th happened to be the day of these murders. On the morning of the 19th, he was supposed to be in Fargo, which is just, you know, it's just across the river from Moorhead. It's one big city with the river as the state border going down the middle. Instead of reporting to the parole agent as he was required to do that morning, he called and said, "I can't meet with you because I'm going out of town. I have to go meet with my lawyer in Bismarck." Telephone records prove he was in town that night. McComas discovered this. He was in Fargo, Moorhead, cell phone tower range. But the following morning, he was going to Bismarck because his lawyer needed to meet with him, which is just completely BS. I mean, he didn't have a vehicle. He didn't have a license. And the public defender is going to require him to drive 250 miles to meet with him for court the following week. That doesn't even make sense. That night, the phone records between Cassie Cruz and Saul's brother phone stopped sometime during early part of the night, 1 o'clock in the morning or something. Just hours prior to the murder, there was 35 phone calls between his phone and Cassie's phone.
And possibly about the same time that Cassie was also calling Megan and threatening to send some people over to the apartment.
Now, remember, John and Megan, they gave Cassie and Saul a ride to Wahpeton to Saul's parents' house. And the following day, when the police went to question Saul at his parents' house, they said he wasn't here, and he had asked them to say that he was there all night, which certainly implies that he wasn't. Otherwise, there was no need to try to get them to do this. And when Cassie was asked about it, the police asked her, "Well, where was Saul?" She said, "Ask Saul where he was." You know, she wasn't alibying him or reporting anything about his doings.
Wow. Just so I get this straight, John, Megan, Saul, and Cassie had all been together earlier that day before you ever came into the picture. And John and Megan had driven Saul and Cassie to his parents' house in Wahpeton earlier that day?
Yep. They had just arrived back in town or back in Moorhead shortly before they picked me up. Wahpeton is, maybe an hour down the road, 50 miles or something like that. After Cassie and Saul arrived in Wahpeton, then the later calls to Saul's brother's phone were all off of the Fargo Moorhead cell towers.
And was Cassie's location that night able to be determined?
Yep, she was in Wahpeton. So she stayed home when the brother left, traveled back to Moorhead where they just came from, or where Saul and Cassie just came from. They returned for whatever their reasons were, but that's where the phone records show that his phone was in Fargo that night, and that in the morning when he was supposed to meet with the release agent, he was on his way out of town.
I wonder how, if Saul and Cassie presumably didn't have a car because they were driven 50 miles by John and Megan, and the brother presumably didn't have a car since he didn't even have a license and he had just been released from jail, could that indicate that there might possibly have been a third person who had a car and drove them all back to Moorhead?
Yes, no, most certainly they had to get a ride from somebody. That was the conclusion, that there had to be multiple assailants. Somebody would have screamed, or somebody would have had the ability to fight back. I mean, John wasn't a little kid. He was almost 6 feet, 250, 60, he has a little bit of weight to throw around.
Right.
This is the thing about Saul's brother phone. It was the only mention of him in the thousands of reports. It's just unbelievable because they knew he was at that house. They just had the incident with him a few days before. Wapaton has a little square 4-room police station. So everybody knows what's happening in that town. And they all knew about him. And his name was mentioned one time somewhere. And Detective Nelson called him and said, "Is this your number?" And he was like, "No, that ain't my number. This is my number." And he gave his father number. And that was the only mention of him. But the phone number attributed to him, that was activated the day he was released from the federal holding. When he was arrested the following week for violating his terms of release, the phone was off. The police knew this was his phone, this was his number. They keep the database of known criminals, wanted criminals. I mean, especially in Moorhead, they're really a law enforcement orientated city. If somebody's on probation or parole or wanted or whatever, all their known information is on there. So it's just unbelievable to me that they wouldn't mention him. There was a concerted effort to keep his name out of the paperwork as far as I can see. It's the only logical conclusion that can be drawn. And I don't know why. I mean, I expect once they started looking at me, that was when some decision was made. Okay, we have to keep him out of it because if his name is brought up or investigated and his recent and prior criminal history comes into play, now we don't have the case against Tracy.
You didn't have a forensic expert at your trial. What you had was a medical examiner who worked in an office that had a long history of basically saying whatever the prosecution wanted them to say. So much so that cases are now getting overturned because of the biased testimony of some of the medical examiners in that office. The medical examiner at your trial implied that the tools recovered from your campsite could have been the murder weapons, and ignored all facts that distinctly show that those tools could not have been the murder weapons. Since your conviction, 2 different independent forensic scientists have examined your case. Let's talk more about what these independent forensic experts have concluded.
Maurice Godwin, he was a forensic scientist out of North Carolina. Maurice, he's done a lot of work with or about serial killers, and he's a professor at Lafayette. He had done a report and, investigating and reviewing all of the evidence and circumstances surrounding these crimes, had determined that it was more than one person. Likely 2, but it wasn't limited to that. Multiple assailants. McComas, during her investigation, she contacted a couple of different forensic groups. There was one out of New York, and we talked to them and said, "Look, we don't have a whole lot of money or anything like that. Do you think, would you want to take a look at this and give us your opinion, or, what's the possibility that these items were used in this crime?" The doctor that did the initial exam was Dr. Marcella Fierro, who, I mean, she's pretty much a superstar in the forensic community. The things she's done and worked for her, she was the chief medical examiner for the state of Virginia, who she's worked for over 30 years, you know. And Dr. Fierro, in her report, you know, she detailed all of the injuries, the scene of the crime, you know, what she observed on the scene and the injuries. And as part of that review, she outlined the measurements and everything, you know, of the wounds and of the tools of mine that they said could have been used in this crime. And nothing matched. You know, it was, most of the statements were pretty conclusive. You know, she said, in reference to my knife, said the blade is too short, the blade is too wide, the blunt end is too thick, and it does not fit the stab wound. The same with the hammer. You know, said there's a cluster of impact wounds that showed a consistent curved pattern that was like 4.7 centimeters, and my hammer was 5.8. You know, so again, all of the wounds that she measured, they're smaller than my tools. They couldn't have been made with them tools, you know. And in her, like, the summary, there was a sentence in there. It said the measurements and characteristics of the stab wounds and hammer do not fit well to the proffered knife and hammer, and did not show any of the victim's DNA, which should have been recovered. Well, the courts took that statement, you know, regardless of the factual determinations she made to these implements. They took that statement and used that as the point of denial. That, well, the report said that they did not fit well to the proffered knife and hammer, did not exclude them, which is complete bullshit. The report excluded them. I addressed it as specific and detailed as I could in the state court, but the state court, they addressed a different issue. The issue addressed in error by the state court was whether it could be conclusively proved that my tools were the murder weapons. And the court ruled that it wasn't possible to conclusively prove that they were the murder weapons, which leaves open a possibility that maybe they were the means that I had or used to commit these crimes. The issue, you know, the issue I raised, it doesn't allow for this factual ambiguity. The Fierro report creates a factual certainty that the state courts refused to address. So when we got back to the federal court, they overlooked it or just had no interest in looking at it, and they just copied the state court reasonings. Well, I guess we missed one point, and that was that on my federal habeas, they gave me a stay and ordered that I return to state court and present this evidence with the Fierro report and everything to the state court for their first, you know, to allow them to decide it first. And that's when the state court, well, they took all of the McComas evidence and said, well, she didn't file an affidavit saying she did this work. That's just, that doesn't make a lot of sense either, because if there's any question, I mean, they have the duty to explore it. You know, all of her investigation and the Fierro report and everything, they create an uncertainty that the court refused to address because McComas didn't file a signed and notarized affidavit. And to top it off, then they addressed a different issue than I actually raised, which was grounds for denial.
That is insane and infuriating. And it just feels like they'd rather come up with one asinine excuse after another to keep from looking at the truth you are spoon-feeding to them. You were related to Megan by way of her longtime relationship with, I think it was your cousin? And therefore you are related to the children she had with your cousin. As you stated earlier, there was and continues to be a lot of hate and unfounded rumors that have been perpetuated by some of Megan's other family members. Are there any members of her family that you've been able to speak with directly?
I talked to her son, and it was a really good conversation. I thought, I wanted to communicate more with him. I think that's it's important. At first I wouldn't talk to him, and I told him, I said, hey, look, the way all of that side of your family acts, they're just completely unwilling to listen to any reason and spreading lies and, just completely making up stories. And he told me, that, he's not a part of that he's moved past all of that, the hatred and lies. His father is my first cousin, and he said that when this happened, we lost two members of our family. His mother and me.
Do you think that this is indicative of any type of shift in the misinformation and blind hatred towards you?
Kind of limited. I'm related to both of her children. And there's an organization, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. I started a program a couple years ago. There was a young girl, she was 15, that disappeared from our community up there. So my family contacted Nevaeh's family. I told them, I said I'd like to get some pictures of her and I'll do a portrait, paint a portrait of her for them. And so they did, and they were agreeable. We got the pictures, and I thought that's really not much. So I did 3 paintings of Nevaeh, and I made 50 pairs of earrings that I donated for a fundraiser for her. And we raised a lot of money, I don't know the exact total, but I gave the portraits, the pictures, the paintings were given to her family. As was the earrings. My sister set up a booth at this craft sale thing, and we gave them half of our area for an awareness and a fundraising campaign. They had the paintings on display, and they had the 50 pairs of earrings, and everybody came and signed the books and bought all of the earrings and donated money, and it turned out so well. And afterwards, they made a post on Facebook or something, said, thank you to Tracy and the Zornes family for doing this for us. This wasn't through any particular channels. All of the money and everything went straight to the family, And as soon as they made their post, now members of Londo family jumped on it, They're like just spewing their hate. And when the uncle said, "Hey, look, this is our 15-year-old baby. She was kidnapped and murdered, or she disappeared, right from in town." They said he's just supporting our cause, and they're like, fuck you and your cause. Like that. How could who would think to say something like that, or to somebody about their children disappearing?
Wow. I don't even know how to respond to that.
Right? It's beyond reason. At that point, the mother, Teddy, she was real put out about it. And that's completely understandable to me, because anything that takes away from the search for Nevaeh is something that it shouldn't be there. There should be nothing more important than the search.
Absolutely. Given the amount of irrational levels of hate you get from some members of the Londo family, who are also members of the tribe, do you ever worry about your future safety when your conviction gets overturned and you are released? Do you ever wonder if they will ever listen to logic, facts, and truth, and what that could potentially mean for your safety if you go back to the reservation, if they don't?
Certainly, anywhere a person is, you have to, perhaps I might have to take greater precaution in some things that I do, but no, I don't, they don't concern me in the least. They're not part of my narrative. I might as well be worried about some other thing I have no control over, that it's unfortunate that they refuse to see reason, but they don't necessarily know the whole story either. Nobody's heard what you have or been able to see the things that you've seen. Right now, we're victims together, them and I. We're both victimized by this crime. Maybe one of them will actually take a moment to listen to what we have to say, or they can get the paper, police reports, lab reports, and such published. Maybe it's not outside the possibility that somebody might actually look at it or pay attention and change their mind.
For the last nearly 14 years, you have struggled to get anyone to listen to you, be it the courts or the general public. We've covered a lot in these 3 episodes. But before we go, is there anything else you would like to say about your case?
I'm not trying to tell anybody you have to believe anything I'm saying. Just take a look at the facts. What was presented in court, what was left out, and what was discovered later. I'm not saying I'm innocent, give me a free ticket out of jail. I'm saying I'm innocent, just take a look at the facts and let's determine something from that point. But just accepting the story and the investigation that the prosecutor presented. My lawyers, they did their best to try to refute that, but they never provided their own narrative. They just followed the one that they were given. And that's what ultimately led to my conviction.
This concludes our multiple-part special on the case of Tracy Zornes. To learn more about Tracy's case and his fight for justice, visit his website at www.freetracyz.com or follow him on Facebook and other social media outlets. This is Just Unjust, and I am your host, Cassie Bordeaux.